Ka kokiri mātou, ka tīmata I tēnei kaupapa. So, tuatahi miha tōna kia koutou, ko huhi mai nei anō. Hikaka katoa I ngā kōrero ko tukuna I tēnei ata. Ka rea kore I tēnei wahanga, ka pērā hoki te āhua. Nō reira kia tātou, ko wai tēnei Māori kura me ki, ko Deb Rewiri tēnei, ko tākoha tōna wā, kia tautoko I te kaupapa o Toi Tangata me ki. No ngā puhi Ngāti Awa te whānau āpanui, mihi atu ana kia koe te whaia. Tōna kaupapa he Oranga Wairua he Tikanga Aroha. So she's the sole director of he Oranga Wairua he Tikanga Aroha, passionate wahine who works to support whānau, hapū and iwi community development. She's known for her good sense of humor and ability to celebrate a process that leads to a greater understanding and meaningful making for both the individual and the collectives. Look forward to some of those hatakihi jokes that are coming fire. Deb has a wealth of experience ranging from presentations to many groups from early years, adolescents, prisons and schools. She is often called upon to deliver kaupapa Māori presentations where science is the beginning to catch up to the indigenous practices pre-colonization. Fits perfectly to the kaupapa that we've been speaking about over the last day and a half. And that kaupapa will continue to roll out. So without further ado, ka whakawhiti atu kia koe e te whaia, e mihi atu ana kia koe koe te wā. Kōkiri hia.
Tēnā koe tārio. Tēnā koutou nā manikura e te ake ana I a tātou tamariki mokopuna. E kia nei te kōrero, ko rātou nā rangatira mō a pōpō. Nō reira, tēnā koutou. Ka tangi I tonu te whatumanawa, ma te hunga wairua rātou, kua whetū rangitia, haere, haere, haere moi. E hoki anō, ki tātou nā tapu wai, tēnā koutou, tēnā anō tātou katoa. Kia ora whānau. I do have a share screen and I really wanted to begin this process of why the neuroscience, that's the language of the Pākehā scientists that discovered this in the 1990s. It's called the decade of the brain. However, the more I read and the more I researched around our tupuna, what I noted was actually the way that they were treating our babies was way ahead of their time. So some of those observations of people like Samuel Marsden, I'll just read some of the quotes that he wrote in 1814. I saw no quarrelling while I was there. They are kind to their women and children. I never observed either with a mark of violence upon them, nor did I ever see a child struck. In 1820, he again journaled, there can be no finer children than those of the New Zealanders in any part of the world. Their parents are very indulgent and they appear very happy and playful and very active. So already what we have is an understanding, because the only way you can perceive another culture is through your own lens. And so already we have an understanding of when the colonizers landed here, they could already perceive that we were doing something that was far different to the practices that they'd come from. What I'm going to do now is share my screen. You won't see me, but you'll see some pictures and I will be talking to them. Please, any questions you want to ask, put them up on the chat box and I will do my best to answer them. I'm sure if we have a period of time when I can answer them rather than interrupting, I will do that. But if there's something really important, I think you'll have to interrupt me, Dario, and tell me what the question is. Ka whai. So what I'm going to really talk about today is how brilliant and intelligent our people were, and I'm going to amplify that in a way that we begin to reconstruct an idea or an ideal of how we were parenting pre-contact. how protective we were and are about our babies. If you notice, I go back to the past and then bring it into the present day context. Our babies' brains grow and develop through our love. I remember I was at a hui once and I was talking about oxytocin and endorphins and neurotransmitters, and one of the kaumātua said to me, kia ora whaea, do those things all mean love? And I said, aye. And he said, well, why don't you just say love? And I said, okay then. So I think it's important to, again, you know, have an understanding, well, for me to understand what those scientific words are in the modern day context, but also to elevate our whakaaro, because, you know, we've come from that whole process where we looked at relationships as being the foundation of anything that we were, you know, in terms of building upon that. So that was maintained and celebrated through whakawhanaungatanga, through manaakitanga, all those processes. Now we have an understanding of how what happens to you in your first 3 years of life determines greatly your pathway for the rest of your life, because we know that 85%, don't ask me how they understand this, but apparently mathematicians, scientists have worked this out, 85% of the weight of your brain is developed within those first 3 years. And again, we can reflect upon how our tupuna and the way that they were with us was very taiterangi Māori. Like our babies weren't even, if you growled a child, it was, you were looked down upon, you know, so this calming process was very, was very much the approach that they took of at that particular period of time. How you can ensure your babies get the best start in life, to ensure they strive for the best. Well, again, a growth mindset. You know, mātauranga Māori is premised off a growth mindset and the positivity. So it's like, I remember a kaumātua, and he said, we didn't so much focus on the problem. We focused on the potential of anybody. And so for us, you know, for me working in this field, and I always think about Sir Mason Jerry, and he talks about a centrifugal. He said, the way that we think in terms of Māori is that it winds up and it winds down, rather than a linear process. So again, thinking about how we do that in a way that actually increases our potential. How you can understand.
Whaea pātai, if you we're hoping to share screen already, nobody can see that, but if it's not time for that yet, yeah, if it's not time for that yet, then haere tonu.
I'm just looking at the screen. I'm not realizing that that other people can't see. So I'll have to come out of here. Let me see if I can try it this way. Aroha mai whānau.
Painoa whae, painoa.
Are people seeing that? No.
Ka whaea.
Mea ka tino raru whaea, kōrero, and ka tae mātou te tono atu I era ki ngā tangata muri. So we can send out those images later if it's a raru.
Okay.
Haere tonu.
All right. Ka pai. So again, premising of the tikanga that we have is like looking at what is the potential within us already, what were the po that held us. And so if we're thinking about mātauranga Māori, we have to think about wairua. One of the key aspects of our tupuna was that understanding of why there was such a protective element that was at play when our babies were born was that their wairua was already intact. Auntie Rose Pere often talked about how they came in fresh from the other side. So understanding their wairua was intact, all we had to do as the whānau that surrounded them was to actually help to build their potential. The interesting thing is that the first neuroscience hui I went to was Dr. Bruce Perry, and he spoke about transgenerational developmental heterogeneity, FLASH, eh? And I went up to him and I said, gee, that's pretty flash. I said, we have another term in Te Ao Māori, which means exactly the same thing. And he said, wow, that's really interesting. What is it? And I said, it's called whakawhanaungatanga. And all it really means is that ability for us to build relationship within the different ages and stages of development. So when we lived in these villages, of course, you know, because I whakapapa to Kōrero, and out on Kahuwera, which was the first parasite that Cook saw when he came into Ipipiri, was our parasite, and our tupuna went out to meet him over 1,000 years ago. And what they had an understanding of way back then was actually the way that we treated our babies was very much embedded in the practices of tikanga at that particular period of time. So they were closer, our babies were closer to the gods than what we were. Because we were now in the physical te tai ao, it was sort of like we had grown up through that, but actually our babies, their specialty was that they'd come in fresh from the other side. And hence those understandings and those observations from others that had come. I talked about the first 3 years is a critical period of time that we now understand. This is when the most brain growth happens. And again, if we reflect on how our tupuna were, that was a period of time when our babies were hiki-hikied. Okay, so you are not spoiling your baby if you hiki-hiki them, because babies cannot lower their stress response system. They actually have to have a grown-up person, another brain, a mature calm brain, to help lower their stress response system. They cannot do that on their own. So I often say this in the prison, how do babies let us know they're hungry, that they need to be hiki-hiki, that they, you know, want a nappy change? All of those things are through the process of crying. Babies cry. It's normal for babies to cry. What they're doing is letting off their stress response system to say, I need help. Because they don't come out saying, oh, mama, feed me, oh, papa, you know, change my nappy. They actually need us to read what they need. Now, pre-colonization, when we lived in these village settings, what we had is 4 adult brains to look after one brain, one baby brain. But we've flipped it on its head now. And so what we've done is isolate our whānau. So we put, you know, what we call single, you know, mamas or papas into a whare on their own, and we're asking them to raise a baby to their optimum level when actually they don't have a system of support holding them. In the villages, we did have that system of support. So how do we, again, evolve it into this current day so that we know that we've got those systems of support in place? That's a question, you know, that each of us, in terms of our own whānau, hapū and iwi development that we have to ask ourselves. So getting back to the mātauranga, what I want to say is there was an anthropologist, his name was Prescott, and he studied Indigenous cultures, and he found that cultures that carried their babies for most of their babyhood actually had lower levels of violence within that culture. Guess who was top of the list? It's all of us. So Māori were top of the list because we were a culture that touched and carried our babies for most of the time. You know, the waha, the way that we wrapped our babies, it carried them close to their bodies, again, lowers the stress response system. When babies have that, what we call the attachment process in this new languaging, or, you know, skin to skin contact, it actually helps babies to come back to a place of calm. Okay, so that is actually helping them to come back to a place of calm. So in Prescott, in studying these Indigenous cultures, he found it in 3 cultures. It was Balinese, hang on, I'm just having a look at my book. I always remember Māori and Balinese and Papago. So those were the 3 cultures he found. And again, it was because they held the babies close to their body. So if we think about that act of carrying, and I always remember my mother saying to me that when I'd go down to Te Kaha, you know, my grandmother, she worked the marakai, and my mother would say, you'd be out of nappies, you'd be off the bottle. She said, because I trained you. And I said, no, Mum, you trained yourself. She hadn't trained me, she trained herself. And then she said, you'd go down to your grandmother. My nana would work in the marakai, and she'd put me back into nappy. She'd carry me on the waha, close to her body. And so these processes, my grandmother already understood. You know, it's not that far away. Often when I'm sharing this whakaaro inside the prison, you know, the tāne and the wahine will say, that happened 200 years ago. What does it matter now? And I remind them of Amster Reedy. He says, it doesn't matter how far back you go, it's how far forward you can take it. So, you know, our academics, like in terms of bringing this knowledge back into our present day context, it's like, how do you take that forward? Because a lot of our people have an understanding that once we're warriors was actually our story and our only story. And it's sort of like to remind them, actually pre-contact, there was an emergent story that somehow we have to wake up our cellular memory. I heard Wayne, Dr. Wayne and Ihi refer to the blood memory. So it's not only the blood memory, it's also our cellular memory that we have to wake up, because it's embedded in those neurons that come on down through whakapapa. I remember a kaumātua from, and I'll often share these stories, these teachings. I was down in Uwawa, and he said to me, this kaumātua, I don't understand, you know, all this science jargon, but he said, I remember back in the day when we worked the marakai, if anyone was carrying hara, they weren't allowed to work in the marakai. But he said, you know the other thing, Deb? They weren't allowed to handle our babies. And so then again, it brings in that whole concept or that context of it takes a village to raise a baby, you know, because the village wrapped around everyone. If somebody needed tautoko, they wrapped around them. So it's, you know, how do we again begin to incorporate that into the modern day world that we currently live in? And, you know, for those of us who are living rurally, we have the advantage of actually knowing and having those villages already established. We know in terms of the hapū development, we know who the ones who we go to in terms of that tautoko, but actually how do we, again, extend or expand on it, these ideas of not the mātauranga, but also using our own science, you know, to actually elevate that and expand on that idea of changing that environment. You know, having those big dreams is really important. Now, I usually have a model of a brain so I can explain what that looks like, because I thought I was neat. I would be able to share my screen. That's not going to happen. So I'm going to use this to look at what the brain looks like. But I might also get you to use your hands to do a bit of traveling around your own head. So what I'd like you to do is to put your 2 thumbs at the back of your head, and you'll feel that there's a curve, okay? A curve that goes up into your skull. So right at the base of your brain is what we call your spinal cord, okay? And that spinal cord sends messages down through the nerve endings to every part of your body. So the brain, and what's the most tapu part of the body, whānau? The head, aye. Again, how clever our people were, really clever. Because housed in there is everything, what we call these neurotransmitters. And here's a fact, again, some mathematician worked this out. Every child is born with over 86 billion brain cells, more than they will ever need throughout their lifespan. The job of those brain cells is to connect themselves up. How do we do that? We actually do it through, not only through our DNA, what we collect from our mama, from our papa, so through whakapapa, as we collect DNA, but also the potential is embedded in our environment. So te tai au, our environment is actually shaping the potential within the brain. And the brain is wiring itself up. The brain doesn't have a mechanism to say, gee, mum, that was a shitty experience. I ain't gonna embed that. It does. Because the first function of the brain is to help us to survive. So that survival mechanism is embedded at a very young age. Again, babies do not have the mechanism to protect themselves. So, you know, we have to fall in love with them. Falling in love with our babies releases oxytocin. It's called the hug hormone within our brain. But here's the interesting thing. When we maintain eye contact, not looking at our telephone while we're breastfeeding the baby, eye contact, when we do that, simultaneously, the baby releases oxytocin too. So all this mechanism is actually provided as a protection. So again, thinking about how our tupuna were. Okay, so here we have spinal cord, okay, connected to the cerebellum. Now the cerebellum, if you feel under that groove, it is housed there. And what the cerebellum is responsible for is actually our movement, our coordination, our balance. Here's an interesting thing. We can actually think whilst we're moving. Now, I remember doing this kōrero with one of the kōhanga reo, and one of the kaiako, he looked at me and he went, uh-oh. And I said, come on, share with me. He said, you know, when the tamariki stand and they share their pepeha? And I said, aye. And he said, they fidget a lot. And I said, aye. This is normal. Children are made to move. They are not made, you know, schools, our education system was set shortly after industrialization. And guess what? We're still teaching to that model now, hundreds of years ago. Now, literacy and numeracy can be taught in any forum. It can be taught in te tai ao. It can be taught with movement, with waiata, with kapahaka. But we've limited our thinking because what we've done is we've colonized our thinking into this is the only way you learn. No, no, no. Anyway, I had a kōrero with him and I said to him, so how do you feel about this now? I said, if you're telling them to stop fidgeting, I said, tell me how many kaumata you see on the marae atia that just stand there and go blah. I said, I don't. I said, some of them are waving their toko around, they're walking up and down, and I said to them, they're never still. So I said, telling our babies to keep still because they're going to learn, as I said, interrupting the learning process. So let them move. Whilst they're moving, they are learning. Now, if we come into the depth, and I'm talking about the depth of the brain. So what we've got is the spinal cord, and this is where we send all the messages to our body, the function. So, you know, how we speak, how we move in our body is really important. The cerebellum is right at the base, movement coordination. Then we go deep, very deep into our brain is what we call the limbic part of the brain. That is responsible for our feelings, our emotional state. Anything, oh, I can hear a baby laughing. Oh, kapai.
Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, no, don't apologize, please. Don't apologize. I've sometimes had 40 toddlers in the room. I just said, oh, I just have to use my loud voice. So very deep within the brain are our emotional centers. So our feelings, our memory centers. So our memory centers are closely aligned to our emotional centers. Makes sense, eh? So what I'd like you to, just for a moment, is to think about an experience that you had when you were about, I don't know, 8 or 10, something that you were enjoying doing. And you were either playing with your siblings or with your mates, or, you know, it was something you were enjoying with your whānau, at the marae, whatever it is. So just for a moment, I want you to think about that. 8 to 10, you're enjoying something. How many, hands up, how many of you had a memory? All right. Okay, so what you're accessing very deep in here is your memory centers, and I said, you know, a happy experience. Okay, so I've already predetermined what you're going to be thinking of. So when we look at, and I'll say this just the once here, when we think about trauma, here's an interesting thing, because we know that a lot of our whānau, and I see it all the time, living out in colour within the prison system, you know, and I just have to have a perfect fave of mine, and I really despair at this, that they put Māori names to some of the units that they're working in. Our tupuna, you know, will be doing flip-flops. Why do we do that? Why do we have places which punish our people and stop them from thinking creatively into a place which punishes them, and then we put a Māori ingoa over it so that they feel more aligned to it. In Arohata, when I was there, they have a place called Ahuru Mōwai. And I said to the wahine there, do you know what this means, what Ahuru Mōwai means? They didn't. And I told them about the sacredness of that name in terms of, you know, growing our pēpi. And they didn't have that understanding. So yeah, sorry, that's a thing of mine. So I had to mention that. So our emotional centers, our memory centers. In terms of trauma, and here's an interesting thing, the more we activate the trauma, the more it becomes a living reality. Okay, the more we activate. So in activating trauma, who is it that's activating it? Is it the therapist, or is it something that we need to actually express to make sense of our world? Emotions are emotions. They, you know, they come and go. They're not something that's like there forever, and no one's in crisis 24/7. So the opportunity to have laughter, to have play, to have these processes engaging our babies in a way that actually helps them to build memories. What we're doing is actually creating capacity to build their learning. So I'll say it again, having joy, fun, laughter that activates oxytocin, endorphins, dopamine, all these neurotransmitters of love, laughter, you know, through whatever process we're bringing to them, is actually activating their learning. A calm brain is a learning brain. So again, I want to read some of these observations back at first contact. So one of the, in 1839, missionary, his name was Richard Taylor, he said, one of the finest, remember the Pākehā were really good at journaling. So these are all their journals that have been opened up through Professor Rawiri Taonui and Professor Dame Anne Salmon. One of the finest traits I have noticed in the New Zealanders is that of parental love. The men appear chiefly to nurse their children and generally to be seen with one on their back covered up under their mats. The little things seem likewise sensible of their father's love, for they seem principally to cling to them. So everybody were involved, everybody in the village, in the hapū, were involved in the parenting. I want to, you know, in 1840, Job Polak, you know, and remember everything was kicking up here in the north. Not to say it wasn't happening down in the other regions. Certainly my mother's whānau are not too happy with my father's whānau when we used to go down there on raiding parties. So yeah, the whānau Apanu were not happy with my father's people. But in 1840, Joel Polak wrote, "It is not uncommon to see young children of tender years sitting next to their parents in the councils, apparently listening with the greatest attention. They ask questions and the chiefs answer them with an air of respect, as if they were a corresponding age to themselves. I do not remember a request of an infant being treated with neglect or a demand from one of them being slighted." So our babies, when they sat in the council of the chiefs of the rangatira, if they asked a question, they were given the same mantle of respect as if they were of a corresponding age. Remember, a calm brain is a thinking brain. They had just come fresh in from the other side. So our tupuna already knew their wairua was intact. Any messages they were going to download and share had to have been very important to listen to. So the last part of the brain, and remember this is, I'm using a lineal process, but the brain is being activated consistently and it's taking in from its environment from a multitude of places. The baby is beginning to understand who I am and how I am in the world, and can I trust these people that I'm looking at? Can I trust them? And if the mechanism for yes happens, well, it's by the way that we interact with them. That's why those environmental factors are so important. I was listening to a kōrero around taonga pūoro, and a lot of these practices have been lost. So the corpus callosum is the thick membrane that separates the two sides of the brain. So that's why the baby is born with the soft fontanelle up here, and that's what we call the soft spot, because it's the fusing together of the two sides of the brain. Generally, it takes around 22 months. So here's an interesting fact, and I was listening to this kōrero, and it comes from Tūhoe. So our tūpuna, what they used to do was to play the taonga pūoro into the soft spot. And what they would play was our tawhito, you know, those old pau. They would play those karakia into the baby's fontanelle. And so they were learning within this process. But not only that, our language centers are developed. Now, there are two language centers. One is called Wernix, and these two language centers are really key in terms of us embedding this information. So again, our tūpuna thought of the, you know, and I was listening to Ihi and Wayne talk about, you know, what we've done is compartmentalize, and I know I'm doing this in terms of the brain, but I want you to think about it in terms of hauora. So the brain is constantly sending messages throughout our body to our mind. So our mind is actually thinking and creating our own understanding as the way that people interact with us. I went on another tangent. I'll come back to it around the language centers. I apologize. I do this.
Pai rawa. I feel like you're just kicking off. We've just lit the wick and it's firing up. And saying that whānau is about 12:30 is when we actually meant to be moving over to the other room. Actually 12:25, but we're going to push it out a little bit because I know everyone else is enjoying the kōrero as well as I am.
Okay.
So ka haere tonu whaia, and I'll give you another marker when we're getting going.
Kia ora. So the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop. And, you know, makes sense to me why they would play the taonga pūoro into the soft spot. The prefrontal cortex is our ability to empathize, to have compassion, to look at humanity in a new way. Now we understand, like, you know, in terms of what has happened to us through colonization, as we got into different parenting practices. So it wasn't the village. We, you know, there's lots of different factors that have played into this. Industrialization, our people left our villages, they went into the cities to begin to work. They were sending money back to the villages, but actually the most important aspect that they were missing out on was actually helping those villages to flourish, was helping those villages for their tikanga to continue to be transmitted down through the next generation. Those of our whānau that stayed there actually are the ones that are carrying the torch forward. You know, those of us, myself included, who are second language learners and tikanga learners, you know, we're trying to bring that information. But what we have to do is just keep on decolonizing our mind. So empathy is the prefrontal cortex. So it helps us to visualize, to be creative, and to also have future forward planning. Again, you know, I keep coming back to, I get it. I get why they were so gentle, loving, and caring with our pēpi. They were so clever, you know, but they had that understanding because why? Why did our tupuna have that understanding? I'll tell you why, because the po were already intact. And guess what they were? They were great observers. So as they watched Te Tai Ao emerging, they understood what was emerging within our pēpis and why that importance of that nurturing behavior had to keep carrying on. So here we have it, you know, hundreds of years later, 1990s, the decade of the brain, neuroscientists, psychologists, experts in their field have suddenly discovered how important those first 3 years are. And I keep reminding our people, our tupuna already knew this. They were already practicing this. Their science was alive and well. And so I don't know if people have questions to ask, but I think that's a good place to stop, Dario. And if there's any questions, I'm happy.
Whaea. I'm going to ask a couple of parts. Well, actually, there's a couple of requests. So I was watching Whaea as you were doing your kōrero and you were talking about the different parts of the roro. I saw three maybe main movements that I saw when you were explaining your kōrero. What I would like to do is ask everyone who's in a position to turn their camera on, and I want to take a screenshot of everyone doing those different nikihanga, that we can pull something from that at a later point. But if you do have any pātai, I think the things that came through in the chat, mainly Whaea, were that you know, he mihi ana kia koe, and as each part of the kōrero came through, they were resonating really well with a lot of those things. And you know, some whānau deciding, cool, I'm gonna get my taonga ori now, and we're gonna practice on pēpi, and you know, there's a lot of different areas in that. So te wahanga tuatahi, the one that I saw Whaea was tēnei, so I'm not gonna do it because I'm gonna need my two hands to take the screenshot, but I want to take a couple. So we'll do 3 different movements. So that's the first one. No reira, koreri, toru, rua, tahi, ka pai. And the next nikihanga I think I saw Whaea was he ahua titaha to mahi, so maybe we'll go with that one first. Ka pai, toru, rua, tahi, ka pai. And I think the last one was kotine, when we were touching the back of our wahanga there. So ka pai, toru, rua, tahi, ano, toru, rua, tahi, toru, rua, tahi. Cool. Because there's so many of you, I've got to scroll through the screen to get everyone in. So he tohu pai tira, mahiranga tira Whaea Deb. So if anyone has any other pātai, you've managed to wrap it up like a champion on time there, Whaea. So mihi nui ana kia koe mai a Toi Tangata. No mātou kia te wai Māori, te whakarongo, te hono, te rongo a tinana a hine ngaro a wairua, a roro me ki, ki ngā kōrero ko takuha mai koe. So yeah, I think one of the things that we would like to do is possibly send out that presentation should anyone want to go through. It might be a variation of the presentation, Whaea, kei a koe tira. So if you can get that through to us, we can ensure that it goes out with the post hui communications, and then people who want to jump in can jump in and learn a little bit more. Ka mohi o mai whānau, our intention is to not leave things as these 45-minute workshops. So what we'd like to do is we're going to invite a lot of our kai kōrero to engage in wānanga ātinana when we do have that opportunity. So for those of you who are sitting there going, oh man, I want some more, it's coming. Koe nā nui ho, kia whakamohi atu kia koutou.